In the autumn of 1884, the gaslit streets of Fairfield, New York, glowed under grand manners where music from lavish balls filled the night. Margaret Hale stood radiant in a silver gown, but her heart was restless. Could one choice change her empty world forever? As couples danced across the polished floor, their laughter felt sharp and hollow to her. She leaned against a tall window, the cool glass under her fingers, and whispered, "Is life just dresses, chatter, and smiles that mean nothing?" Known as Fairfield's brightest star, Margaret was weary of being admired for her beauty alone. She wanted something deeper, something true. One morning, while flipping through the Fairfield Gazette, she found a small ad tucked between notices for farm tools. Widowed rancher in Aspen Hollow, Wyoming, seeks a kind-hearted woman to help raise his daughter. Must be strong and ready for a new start. Her pulse quickened as she read it again. "I'll write to him tonight," she said, her voice steady with resolve. This was her chance to escape a life that felt like a gilded cage, but the path ahead was unknown, and the weight of her decision pressed heavily. Far from the grandeur of Fairfield, with its opulent ballrooms echoing laughter, polished silver trays, and the soft rustle of silk dresses, Henry Whitmore had carved a life from grit and timber, not from marble and manners. His ranch, nestled near Aspen Hollow, Wyoming, was untouched by elegance but rich in its own quiet nobility. The land stretched wide and wild beneath a sky that seemed to go on forever, where snow-kissed mountains stood like solemn sentinels, and the wind carried both chill and comfort, whispering through the tall grasses like a voice too old to remember its beginning. The house Henry had built with his own weather-worn hands stood sturdy against the seasons, a reflection of the man himself, unadorned, durable, and marked by the weight it carried. Within its timber walls, the silence was deep, broken only by the ticking of a worn clock or the occasional creak of boards settling into the cold. It was not just the winters the house had withstood. It had weathered something deeper, grief that settled in the corners like dust, memories that clung to the air like smoke. 3 years had passed since Henry had buried his wife beneath the cottonwood tree on the edge of the property. The grave was marked only by a stone he had carved himself, and a small wooden bench where Vivian sometimes sat, her sketchbook in her lap, her tiny boots brushing the earth. Time hadn't erased the ache. It had only dulled the sharpest edges, like wind smoothing stone. But the hollow space left behind had never quite closed. Vivian was 7 now, all quiet intensity and curious eyes. She spoke little, just like her father, but she saw everything. Her world was made of lines and shadows, of color captured in black and white sketches that spilled from her pencil with uncanny detail. She sat for hours beneath the cottonwoods or beside the creek, drawing the world as she felt it. The curve of a horse's neck mid-gallop, the shimmer of wind across water, the almost visible memory of a woman with soft eyes and wind-tousled hair. As if, through charcoal and paper, she could bring her mother back, not in body, but in spirit. Henry lived in rhythm with the land, up with the sun, hands in the soil or gripping tools, his boots worn smooth by use. The days were long and full of labor, but it was the kind of work that kept grief at bay. His solace came in small things. The warmth of coffee by the fire, the creak of the barn door swinging open, the knowledge that Vivian was safe and fed and slowly healing in her own way. His younger brother, Thomas, was everything Henry wasn't. Easy with words, warm-hearted, a man who hadn't learned to love from loss. He visited often, under the pretense of mending fences or checking cattle, but Henry knew better. Thomas was there to keep him tethered to the world, to remind him he was still a man, not a ghost. One crisp morning, frost painting the fence posts silver, Thomas leaned casually against the gate, his breath misting in the cold. Henry shoveled feed in silence, shoulders tense. "You're fading, Henry," Thomas said after a pause, his voice low but edged with truth. You live like the best part of your story already ended. But there's still time to turn the page. You need someone who sees you. Not just a hand in the kitchen or another pair of boots in a barn. Someone real. Henry didn't look up. He didn't have to. He'd heard the words before from Thomas, from others, but always dismissed them like a stray breeze. Yet that morning, something in his brother's tone lingered. Something more urgent, more personal. But Thomas, persistent as ever, had already acted on that belief. Without Henry's knowledge, he'd written to the Wyoming Gazette. The ad was simple. No flourishes, no appeals to romance. Just an honest invitation from a man too tired for games, too worn for pretense. Widowed rancher seeks companionship. Life is hard but honest. There's room here for someone true. Weeks passed. Henry didn't know about the ad until a letter arrived. It came in a plain envelope, corners slightly bent, the handwriting neat but uncertain, like someone steadying their hand against a storm. The letter inside wasn't long, but it was honest. It didn't promise magic. It offered something rarer, understanding. I don't know much about ranch life, it read, but I do know what it feels like to be lost. I'm not looking for promises. I've had enough of those. I want a place where my truth won't feel like a burden. If nothing else, I'd like to write. Words are all I have right now. Her name was Margaret. Henry read the letter twice, slowly, as if afraid the words might slip away if he rushed. Something in her voice, her vulnerability, her quiet strength, spoke to a part of him that had been silent for too long. He answered that night. I have a ranch, a daughter, and too much quiet. If you're real, I'll write again. And so, the letters began. At first, they were cautious, polite, like two strangers tipping hats on a dusty road. But week by week, the words deepened. Henry told her about the ranch, how the light changed in the mornings when frost melted from the fence rails, how Vivian made up songs when she thought no one was listening. He confessed that sometimes the quiet was too loud, that he still reached across the bed in the middle of the night and remembered too late that no one was there. Margaret's letters came like balm on old wounds. She wrote of her life in Missouri, of feeling out of place in a world that demanded smiles when all she wanted was truth. She wrote of walking barefoot in creeks as a girl, of dreaming of places where the sky wasn't boxed in by buildings. She admitted that she'd been invisible for too long and longed simply to be seen. Each letter stitched something back together. The miles between them shrank, not by road, but by trust. Henry found himself waiting for her words like sunrise, unfolding her letters beside the fire, imagining her handwriting as the shape of her voice. Sometimes he read them twice before bed, as if afraid he might miss a meaning tucked between the lines. Still, a question lingered in the quiet, like the wind before a storm. Could two people who had lived so long in their separate silences truly build something lasting? Could words, ink on paper, no matter how sincere, lay a foundation for something real, something that could weather grief and grow roots in the rocky soil of a second chance? Henry didn't know, but each time he opened one of Margaret's letters, his hands didn't feel quite so empty. And for the first time in 3 long years, hope, soft, uncertain, but steady, began to move through the halls of his home. Margaret's letters to Henry quickly became more than mere correspondence. They became her anchor, a lifeline pulling her towards something she had never dared to believe she deserved. Each letter she sent was like planting a seed in unfamiliar soil, hoping it might bloom into something real, something she could call her own. She would read his replies late into the night by the dim light of her bedside candle, her fingers tracing the words, as though she could touch the land he described, feel the quiet strength in his voice, and sense the shadows he carried with him. There was no poetry in his writing, but there was honesty, something raw and unadorned, and after years of being surrounded by half-truths and fragile facades, that honesty felt revolutionary. It was a truth Margaret hadn't even known she was longing for, one that spoke to her heart in a way words alone could never express. By night, when the house was still and the world expected nothing more from her, Margaret would unroll maps of the American West. She studied the train routes to Wyoming with a sense of longing, her eyes lingering over the small that marked Aspen Hollow. Her thoughts wandered, trying to imagine what the place might look like at sunrise, what kind of silence might live there, what kind of life she could find in the wide spaces between the trees and beneath the open sky. She traced the journey with her finger, moving from town to town, first Chicago, then westward, stop by stop, memorizing every name as though each one was a prayer, a step closer to the life she was building in her mind. Her dreams were vivid now, fueled by the words Henry had shared, and the hope that perhaps, just perhaps, she might find a place where she could leave the ghosts of her past behind. There was only one person who knew of her plan, her cousin Julie. Julie was bold, fiercely loyal, and the only one who ever truly saw Margaret beyond her polished smile. On a warm, wind-kissed night beneath the orchard trees, with moonlight spilling through the branches like soft silver threads, Julie found her standing outside, staring at the sky. Margaret clutched Henry's latest letter to her chest, as if it were her only tether to a world that felt both distant and near. Julie, sensing the weight of the moment, asked softly, "You're really leaving all this behind?" Her voice was a mix of awe and fear, but there was no judgment, only an understanding of the depth of Margaret's decision. Margaret didn't hesitate. "I've lived their story long enough," she said quietly, her eyes focused on the stars above. "It's time to write my own." The decision was made, but it wasn't an easy one. The moment of departure arrived on the night of her younger sister's debutante ball, a night that was meant to dazzle, to impress, to solidify their family's place in society. The grand hall glittered with chandeliers, the air filled with the light sounds of music and laughter, while dancers twirled beneath golden lights. Margaret stood on the sidelines, observing the performance from the corner of the room. She was dressed in silk, her hair pinned just so, but to her, it all felt like a scene from someone else's life. She felt disconnected, like an observer of a world she no longer belonged to. No one noticed when Margaret slipped away. Her suitcase waited hidden beneath the servant stairs, packed only with the essentials: sturdy boots, wool skirts, her bundled letters tied with ribbon, and the courage she had been gathering for months. The rest of the world moved on without her, wrapped in its own expectations. As the midnight train's whistle echoed through the night, Margaret stood at the edge of everything she had ever known. The wind tugged at her coat as she stepped aboard, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. She didn't look back. Through the window, the world she was leaving behind blurred into shadows. The stars wheeled overhead like silent witnesses as the train carried her west, deeper into the unknown. She pressed her forehead to the cool glass and whispered to the night, "Let him be real." The journey was long, and the hours felt endless. The landscape outside the train window slowly shifted from bustling cities to quiet fields and then to wide, open plains. With each passing mile, Margaret shed another layer of a life she no longer wanted. By the time the train began its climb through the mountains, she felt like someone new, unpolished, unbound, but ready. The uncertainty in her chest was still there, but it was now tempered by a quiet excitement, a growing belief that she was on the brink of something real, something that might change everything. At last, Aspen Hollow came into view. It was a quiet station, nestled beneath a sky as wide as forever. She stepped off the train, her feet meeting the dusty platform, the air sharp with the scent of pine and distant snow. Her breath curled in the cold morning light, and she took a deep, steadying breath as she looked around. She didn't know what she had expected, but there he was. Henry stood waiting beside a weather-worn wagon, his tall figure plain but sturdy, his coat dusted with trail and time. His presence was like the land surrounding them, solid, unshaken, deeply rooted in a quiet strength. He held her gaze with a certainty that spoke louder than words. And though he only said 3 simple words, they landed with the weight of everything that had gone unsaid between them. "You came," he said, his voice low and steady. "I said I would," Margaret replied, her chin lifting slightly, her voice steady despite the tremble in her hands. In the wagon, a small figure sat curled up, a sketchbook clutched tightly in her lap like a shield. Vivian, Henry's daughter. Her wide eyes watched Margaret with the careful caution that only children seem to understand. Not fear, but something else, a quiet calculation, a guard built from the loss of too much too soon. The silence between them was thick, layered with uncertainty and the weight of 2 lives meeting at the edge of possibility. But beneath it, like a spring thaw beneath snow, something stirred, fragile, new. A beginning, not yet spoken, but already taking root. And with it, a quiet hope that maybe, just maybe, this was the moment everything would begin to change. The ranch was a world far removed from the polished refinement Margaret had known in Fairfield. Here, beauty was not something that could be arranged or bought. It was earned through the rawness of nature and the daily grind of survival. Every morning, a delicate veil of frost clung to the windows, a constant reminder of the harshness outside. Before the sun even crested the hills, the air was thick with the scent of pine, damp earth, and the cold bite of winter. The rhythm of the land was unforgiving, relentless, demanding attention without apology. There were no maids, no servants, no gleaming silverware. There was only the steady sound of boots crunching over frozen ground, the biting cold, and the breath visible in the early morning air as Margaret learned to navigate this world, a world where nothing came easily. At first, Margaret struggled. Everything seemed foreign and difficult. The pump handle, stiff from the cold, bit into her hands until they blistered. Water splashed everywhere as she fumbled with it, soaking her dress. Her first attempts at baking were disasters. The bread blackened on the edges while the inside remained undercooked, doughy and unappetizing. The fragile eggs, once carefully cradled in baskets, slipped from her hands, shattering on the wooden floor. Yet, despite every failure, she didn't stop. Each misstep chipped away at her pride, but not at her determination. She kept trying, kept pushing forward. Henry, in his quiet way, never criticized. He never raised his voice. Instead, he stepped in when needed, calm, unhurried, always offering a quiet solution. He fixed the pump when it stuck, adjusted the firebox when the stove refused to cooperate, and even showed her how to handle fragile eggs with a gentle touch, like cradling something precious. There was no judgment, only an understanding patience that Margaret didn't know she needed. Vivian, however, was different. She was distant, watching from the sidelines like a silent observer. Margaret saw her most afternoons, sitting near the window with her sketchbook balanced on her knees, her eyes focused on the world outside. She drew the corral, the barn, the sprawling lines of mountains beyond. Sometimes Margaret noticed that in the pages there was a faint shape, a figure of a woman, hair trailing like smoke, never fully defined. Margaret didn't ask about it. She understood the silence all too well, the quiet grief that seemed to settle between them. Margaret made attempts to bridge the distance between them. She offered warm bread, tried to start conversations, even suggested braiding Vivian's hair. But each time, Vivian resisted, narrowing her eyes with a kind of wary caution. So Margaret stopped trying to fill the silence with words. Instead, she simply chose to exist in the same space. She folded linens at the table where Vivian sat drawing, hummed softly as she chopped vegetables at the counter, and left small things behind without comment. Things like a book about horses placed by the windowsill, a sharp pencil for sketching, or a scarf with violets stitched at the edges. She didn't demand attention, didn't seek thanks. She only wanted to share the space they occupied, allowing Vivian to absorb her presence at her own pace. Then came the storm, a sudden and violent shift in the weather. It rolled in with no warning, dark clouds stacking over the hills like an ominous threat. The wind howled through the eaves, rattling shutters, bending trees, and lashing the windows with sheets of rain. The thunder cracked loudly, sharp and close, while the fire in the hearth hissed against the sudden gusts of cold air. Margaret sat by the flames, the steady rhythm of her needle pulling thread through the worn fabric of Henry's shirt. The cloth, soft and faded from use, seemed to mirror her own sense of weariness and longing. It was then that she first noticed Vivian, though she hadn't heard her approach. The soft hush of bare feet on wood was the only sound that alerted Margaret to her presence. In the doorway, the small figure of Vivian stood silhouetted by the flickering light from the storm outside, clutching her sketchbook tightly against her chest. Her shoulders were tense, her posture stiff, as if the storm outside had settled inside her as well. Margaret didn't stand. She continued stitching, her voice low and steady as she spoke. "Storms pass. This one will too. Want to sit." Her tone was calm, unhurried. She knew, somehow, that this moment wasn't about fixing anything. It was about allowing the space to exist between them without forcing words. Vivian hesitated. Her eyes flicked between Margaret and the flames, uncertainty written on her face. But slowly, cautiously, she crossed the room and sat down on the rug, her legs tucked beneath her. Her sketchbook remained unopened in her lap, her small figure holding it like a shield. Margaret didn't press, didn't ask her to talk. Instead, she began to speak. Her voice had gentle cadence amidst the storm's fury. "There was once a girl," she said. "She was small like you. One night, the wind came roaring through her valley, pulling everything into the air, trees, houses, even her fears. So she followed it, through hills and shadows, through places she didn't know. And after the storm, she found a quiet valley. No one knew her there. She could start fresh." Vivian didn't respond in words, but Margaret saw it. Just a slight shift, a small movement in her posture, as if the story had softened something inside her. She leaned in a little, her shoulder brushing against the edge of Margaret's skirt. In the hallway, unseen at first, Henry stood watching them from the shadows. His arms were crossed, his face unreadable, but his eyes held something caught between caution and hope. The flickering firelight danced across his features, making him look momentarily younger, less burdened by years of quiet endurance. He looked as though he was holding his breath, waiting for something he wasn't sure would come. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside, something had changed. The silence no longer felt oppressive. It no longer felt like an empty space that demanded to be filled. It felt like a bridge, narrow and fragile, but real, something tentative and unspoken, yet undeniably present. It was a quiet moment of connection, one that neither of them fully understood, but both could feel. And for the first time in weeks, Margaret wondered if it might be the beginning of something new, something neither of them had expected. Morning came gently, as if the storm had never happened, leaving only a hush behind. The world outside the windows glistened with dew, soft silver drops clinging to the grass and fence posts. The air was cool, tinged with pine, and something quieter still, peace. Inside the house, the fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow across the floorboards. Vivian slept curled on the rug, her sketchbook resting open beside her like a secret she'd forgotten to hide. Margaret approached quietly and knelt to look. On the page was a meadow beneath an open sky, wildflowers in strokes of soft blue and golden yellow. Two figures walked side by side, hand in hand, their shapes simple but unmistakably close. Margaret's throat tightened. She didn't move when Henry stepped through the front door, his boots leaving a trail of damp prints across the threshold. He paused when he saw them. Vivian's small form, the sketchbook, Margaret kneeling nearby in the hush of morning light. She used to rest like that when the nights were cold, he said, voice husky, almost distant. Margaret turned toward him, her expression gentle. She didn't ask who she was. She already knew. The woman who lingered in every corner of this house. In the way Henry watched the wind, in the guarded look Vivian carried. Margaret simply nodded and let the silence stretch between them. Honest, raw, necessary. She's finding her way, she said softly, her hand brushing a stray curl from Vivian's forehead. So are you. Henry looked down, then out the window toward the rising sun. He didn't speak, but the lines around his eyes softened. That evening, after the day's work was done and the house had quieted again, they found themselves by the fire once more. Vivian had gone to bed early, her sketchbook tucked beneath her pillow. The logs cracked and sighed as flames reached upward, casting flickers of gold across the worn wooden walls. Henry sat with his hands resting on his knees, silent for a long time. Margaret sat across from him, mending a pair of gloves, though her needle had stilled. Outside, the wind rustled through the tall pines like a lullaby for the land. Then he spoke. After I lost her, he began, his voice low and deliberate. It was like the whole world turned to stone. I moved through the days, did what needed doing, but nothing felt alive. I thought I'd never feel again. Not like that. Not anything. Margaret didn't interrupt. She waited, the space between them filled with the quiet weight of his words. But then, he continued, your letters came. One by one. Words on paper, and somehow they cut through all that silence. You brought color back into the edges. Margaret set the gloves aside and leaned forward, her voice steady. I didn't come here to replace what was lost. I came to find my own place, to see if there was something real left in the world for me, too. Not to take anyone's, just to be part of something that matters. He looked at her then, and for the first time, the walls in his eyes fell away completely. The hurt, the fear, the cautious hope. It was all there laid bare. Margaret reached for his hand. Her touch was gentle but certain, her fingers threading with his as if they belonged there. When their lips met, it was not a grand gesture, not a sweeping declaration. It was quiet, warm, a truth shared between two people who had once stopped believing in second chances and were now learning that maybe, just maybe, they still existed. Outside, the pine trees swayed gently in the night breeze, their needles whispering promises the wind had carried for miles. Inside, a new warmth settled between them, not just from the fire, but from something more enduring. A beginning. The ranch, once defined by its routines and ghosts, now held a new rhythm. But its future wasn't promised by that kiss, nor by any single moment. It would depend on what they built day by day, through trust, tenderness, and the bravery it took to love again. And in the quiet flicker of the flames, it was clear they were willing to try. The days grew brighter, not just with sunlight, but with something warmer, something that settled into the walls and the spaces between them. It was in the way the windows stayed open longer, letting in the breeze, and how the scent of wildflowers began to replace the lingering chill of winter. It was subtle, slow, like spring creeping back after a long silence. Vivian no longer hid in the corners of the house. She began to appear more often at the kitchen table, her small frame bent over her sketchbook, the charcoal strokes of her drawings growing bolder. Margaret moved nearby, kneading dough or peeling apples, careful not to press too hard against the delicate balance they'd found. Sometimes they didn't speak, just shared the room, the rhythm, the trust. It was enough. Henry, too, changed. He no longer vanished after supper into the barn or the fields. Instead, he lingered. At first, he sat silently at the edge of the hearth, sipping coffee, listening. But gradually, he began to speak. Soft tales of his father's horses, of storms that shaped the land, of stars that burned over Wyoming with secrets he still tried to understand. His voice, once used only for necessity, now offered memories like quiet gifts. Then came the swing. One bright morning, Henry rose early and walked to the old elm tree near the edge of the property, one that had stood through every season like a century. With rope and wood, he worked through the morning, hands steady and sure. Margaret watched from the porch, Vivian beside her, curiosity flickering in the girl's eyes like light on water. By midday, the swing hung gently from the thick branch, swaying in the breeze. Henry gave it a small push, testing its weight, then looked to Vivian. "It's yours if you want it." At first, she hesitated. Then slowly, almost reverently, she approached, climbed on, and pushed off. Her laughter came like a sudden bell in the still air, clear, unguarded, wild. Margaret turned her face to the sky and closed her eyes. It was the sound of healing. Days passed like petals falling from an unseen bloom. And one morning, as the sun slid softly over the hills, Vivian brought Margaret a drawing. It was simple, yet profound. 3 figures under the elm tree, hands linked, faces bright with joy. Margaret's throat tightened as she took it in. "Will you stay?" Vivian asked. Her voice was small but sure, as if the question had waited in her heart for weeks. Margaret knelt down slowly, cradling the drawing like it was something sacred. She looked into Vivian's eyes, saw the courage it took to ask. "As long as you want me," she replied, her voice steady, her eyes misted with something deeper than words. That evening, the sky caught fire with sunset. Gold spilled over the fields, catching in the tall grass and outlining the hills in light. On the porch, Margaret stood beside Henry, her fingers twined with his. There was no grand speech, no ceremony, just a quiet moment, and a simple gold ring he had slipped on her finger earlier that day. It gleamed faintly in the dusk, a promise made in silence, firm and enduring as the earth beneath their feet. Vivian's giggles rang from the elm tree as the swing moved in a lazy arc, her hair flying back, her joy as boundless as the horizon. The porch creaked beneath their feet, the boards old but strong, holding them up as they watched the world settle into twilight. Above them, the sky stretched wide and endless, painted in shades of rose and indigo. They didn't need to call it home. The land already had. In its quiet way, it welcomed them all. Here, in the hush between day and night, where sorrow had once lived and laughter had returned, love had taken root, patient, resilient, and ready to grow through every season. Steady and true. If you love this journey, don't forget to like and subscribe for more heartfelt stories.